Hello, everyone, and thank you, Asia Society and Kalakoda Art Festival for having us over here. And thank you all for coming. Um, it's wonderful to see you all here, and thank you, Kazi, for your wonderful company. If you haven't yet seen this book, please waste no more time after this. Go and get yourself a copy. um, if I would wish every river in the world to have a book like this about it, written about it, because I think what Kazi has done with this book is all encompassing. He touches upon so many aspects of a river, and a river itself is a creature that is multifaceted. And to be able to encapsulate the wonder that follows any river in pages, I think he's done quite an impossible job. Thank you for doing it, and congratulations. So I'm going to ask you the obvious question. How did you conceive of something so enormous, and how did you pull it off? What went through your mind at the beginning, and how did you make it?
Thank you, Arati. But I must, as you thank Inakshi, Asiatic Society, and all the friends at Asiatic Society and Kalagura Festival for inviting me to this session. I have been to Mumbai a few times, the first time with the Kalagura Festival in action. So it's a great opportunity for me. And to have this book discussion at tandem with the festival. So that's great. The origin of the book, it's difficult to ascertain. First of all, for someone from Bangladesh, Podda is always with you. So Podda is like, pronounced in different ways. I must say that first. Padma could be seen in the Sanskritic form and as well as an anglicized form, but in Bengali it's Podda. So we go back and forth. I wanted to give the title, the river, the Great Padma, to kind of shift the naming politics, if you like. But then we looked up internet and the name Padma doesn't really appear, right? And Padma appears, but it's mostly Padma Lakshmi. Right. At the first few Google openings. In any case, Podda is always there for someone in Bangladesh as well as the Bengali, So by Bengali, I mean Bengalis in West Bengal or other parts of India, on the other side of the border. And I realized doing the book that there's so much nostalgia for the Podda, for especially Bengalis in West Bengal and people who have moved before 1947. I think the imagination and the memory is really about the river or perhaps the house that they left, but journeying across eastern Bengal, which is Bangladesh, So first thing is that the Podda is always with you. But then you rediscover the Podda in one way or another. Being there on the shores of the Padma, I say the shores or the banks because I describe the Podda as oceanic, as an oceanic river, which is a terminology that I would like to use. In Mumbai, you face the ocean, and you live in an oceanic environment, if you like. And there's a kind of, I would say, a directness to facing the ocean. But with a river, it's not always direct because the river flows in and out. You're in with the water. So it's a different kind of experience being with the river. So that thing of Podda being always there in your mind, whatever strata of the society you are in is there. Because, Podda exists in folk music and folklores, in poetry, in contemporary poetry to folk poetry. It's announced or revived one way or another. As I describe, the Podda is the existential spine of Bangladesh, or I would expand it and say Bengal. By that I mean that, the Podda is not just a river that flows with water, and I'm sure you'll talk about silt and sediment, but it provides the sort of the basic life energy to the people who lives on the banks and away from the banks also, fishermen, farmers, trading. And then we can discuss that in a bit, Arthi, how the sediment from not only the Padma, other rivers are transported to the city, transformed and baked into bricks, and the cities become. So Dhaka city, which is as crazy as Mumbai, I would say, and Inakshi has been there, it's actually a transformation of the silt of the Padma and other rivers and made into a city. So I think Padma exists in more than one way than just being a ribbon of water. And so, but quickly, how did I come to the book? Well, I'm an architect. I have to explain this. And unlike you, brave, intrepid writer, voyager, I'm not that brave as you. I read part of the Marginlands. My God, I wouldn't be able to do that. You know, being on a boat on the coastline of the Bay of Bengal near the Sundarbans, no. So I write. I'm an architect, but I've been writing, and this is also, I think, part of the discussion. Why should one write? And an architect writing about a river, because I kind of came to the understanding of being an architect in Bengal in the Delta. It's not only about designing a building. You can't just do that. Sometimes, because there is no such thing as a building standing on its own. It's it's in an environment all the time, and in the delta landscape the environment is always shifting and in flux and fluctuation. And so even before thinking about the building, and I say that regularly in Bangladesh, that architectural training in Bangladesh should involve understanding the rivers. There's no such thing as that, but I say that because without really understanding how the landscape is, you think of making buildings which are static, stable, and supposed to stand up for thousands of years. They don't. There are photographs in the book of like 3-4-story buildings, schools, mosques, and temples just tumbling into the Padma. So I, with my team, had been studying rivers in Bangladesh, river basins. More beyond the rivers, I'm interested in river basins, the nature of the flow and fluctuations of water. And that led us to really looking at Padma closely with my team of geographers. I run the Bengali Institute, and we have a fantastic group of geographers. And just before COVID, we were like really looking very closely, looking at old maps, how the Padma or the Ganges is depicted. And that during the COVID, since we're all stuck in different places, we thought, let's just make it a book. So that's the origin.
That's fabulous. You bring up a really good point about how architecture does not exist in isolation, and it's intricately woven into the landscape. That's really important. Especially, all of us in Bombay, we know how we come every rains, we have the floods,
Right.
and still we build in ways that are not necessarily solving any of the issues. So yes, definitely that makes a whole lot of sense. I just wanted to set a context here. The Podha or the Padma is how many of us have been there? How many of us have been on the Ganga in the West Bengal? In West Bengal. Okay, great. So when the river comes down, makes the turn from Bihar and flows down into West Bengal, there is a point at which one part comes down south and goes into the delta on the Indian side. But then there is this massive main stem that makes a left turn and goes into Bangladesh. And when that happens, it not only changes its name, as we will discuss, a lot of things change. It goes from Ganga to being called Padma. So this really is the Ganga, the main stem of the Ganga that goes into Bangladesh. And what Kazi was also mentioning, Bangladesh is, almost all of it is a deltaic region. And in the words of a geographer called William Van Schendel, he said that Bangladesh essentially is the Himalayas flattened out, because these rivers cart enormous amounts of sediment and they bring it down and then they deposit to build these deltas. And Bangladesh is largely deltaic. And the rivers, there are 58 rivers?
Major rivers.
Major.
And there are
Smaller rivers. And 57 of them flow through India, I think,
Right.
before coming to Bangladesh.
transboundary.
Yeah, they're all transboundary rivers. So it's a land in flux. It's constantly moving. And so it's really important for people like Kazi to understand how then to make something that is at least permanent on such an ephemeral landscape. Having said that, let's get to that point where it leaves India, the river, and it enters Bangladesh. There is this small little town called Nimtita, and that's the point at which the river bifurcates. And Kazi has a beautiful way in the book of explaining and talking about what happens to the river and what happens to Ganga and what happens to Podda. And I think I'll let you describe this ecological axis, as you call it.
And that's your last question, because, answering that would be like, the rest of the session, right? Because that was actually the primary reason for doing the book. You asked me about when I started working on the book, the origin of the book, but there was a primary reason. There are a few reasons. One was, and of course, I'm enamored of rivers. I've become a river person for a long time. And of course, Ganga or Ganges, is something that I follow, look at. And every book that's published on the Ganges, I buy. But I started to realize, every book, there's a book on the Ganges every other year. Either it's a photographic book or a scholarly book or something or other. And I immediately go to the index, and there's the mention of the Podda. So the point is that in the big narrative of the Ganges, and which is a big narrative, from Ganges as the fantastic mythological imagination as well historical imagination that has captured our imagination in the subcontinent for thousands and thousands of years. But all of a sudden, when it nears that particular point, when it becomes the Padma, and from which point it becomes the Padma, that's also a bit ambiguous. But nonetheless, it peters away. There's no mention of the Padma. And that's one thing that I wanted to tackle, because I argue in the book, or we argue in the book, that it is actually the flow of the Ganges that goes straight into, what is Bangladesh and becomes the Padma, while Hooghly Bhagirathi is a distributary, is a channel. And that's my contention. While the contention of many geographers and historians in the western part of Bengal, and I'll be in trouble in Kolkata because I'm going to the Kolkata Literary Meet, I'm going to be saying these things, and I think I'll be in a little trouble with my friends there, that they claim that the Ganga always flowed through Hooghly Bhagirathi with its full force, and sometimes in the 16th or 17th century, because of natural sort of subsidence and other things, it deviated and went through eastern Bengal and became the Podda. Podda was always a khal, a canal. So that's the contention. So I want to kind of, contest that in the book, because geographical analysis, hydrological analysis, and literary descriptions, and I looked at as far back as we can go and listen to the descriptions of the Podda in any kind of text, that doesn't say so. It's always been this sort of, that it had many names, beautiful names also. It was originally called Poddavati, Padmavati. In the writing of Abul Fazl mentions that Padmavati, and then other sort of, unknown writers who mentioned this. It's also often called Mahasindhu, Mahaganga, Totini, like beautiful names, So I think my intention was to restore Ganga in the Padma. And the Hooghly Bhagirathi has always been a channel. Why it is referred to as the Ganga, and I think that is another discussion we had, it is because the Ganga obviously has acquired a sacred quality, again for thousands of years, mythological reasons, religious reasons, perceptions, and that sacredness was diverted as well with the waters of Hooghly Bhagirathi. And I have argued how that is historically so, because of the establishment of Navadvip in Nodia as a center of Hindu learning since the 11th and the 12th century. And it's the Sena rulers who came from the south, I believe, who displaced the Pal kings, were Buddhist. The Senas were Hindus from the south, and they brought in also high caste priests from there and centered themselves in Navadvip. Navadvip literally translates as the new island. And that's on the western bank of Hooghly Bhagirathi. If you even analyze which settlements and towns are the western bank and the eastern bank, which is also an interesting story, how much later when with the Portuguese and the English making settlements. Nonetheless, so there is then a need to make the waters of Hooghly Bhagirathi more than just the waters of Hooghly Bhagirathi. It became the Ganga because of the presence of Hindu imaginary in Navadvip. And anything east of Navadvip, the banks, according to the Senas also, the Sena kings and the Sena imagination, is lower class Hinduism. As I have noted, people call it degradation. Even people who live there, and I'm talking about before it became Islamicized and all that. So there is a difference of the peoples also, even if they are in one form or another belonging to Hinduism or Buddhism, they are of a different caste. Even if high Kulin Brahmins went off to the eastern part, they have to come and cleanse themselves.
Yes.
So definitely Navadvip became a very sort of heartthrob of Hindu seat of learning and perceiving the geography, of the entire region. So it's the politics of geographic imagination.
So that's fascinating. And of course, for us, we have seen largely, the narratives that flow along the Hooghly Bhagirathi, and that's what we are familiar with. However, interestingly, while the Ganga is sacred, and this is something that I speak of at length in Marginlands, and in fact, there's going to be an expanded chapter in the paperback that's going to be coming out in February on this. And that's why I love this book so much, because it just kind of dovetails into the kind of work that Marginlands speaks to too. Basically, the fact that Ganga is sacred to us does not seem to stop us from doing absolutely profane things to it. And one of them happens right there, slightly north of this ecological axis, slightly north of Nimtita. There is a barrage called Farakka, which stops the Ganga. It's like this wall at which the Ganga comes and finds itself impeded. And the Ganga, which is coming from the Himalayas, which is a very young mountain range, is full of silt. So much so that all that silt gets built up behind Farakka, and a lot less comes down to build up the delta. See, the silt is needed to build the delta. But on this side of the border, I guess, of the man-made border, there's a lot less silt coming down because of Farakka. And just to give you a sense, if one truckload of silt would be about 7 cubic meters, the amount of trucks, by just desilting that bed, the amount of trucks you would get would go around the equator 126 times. Let that just sink in. That much silt since 1975, which has basically deprived the delta, the West Bengal Delta, of silt, which is needed to shore itself up. Now, what it also does is it holds back water, it diverts water into the Hooghly Bhagirathi, and that then is something that deprives the Padda of water. It deprives a whole a bunch of districts in Bangladesh of water. So basically, we are altering this ecology of the nature of the river and how it flows with its sediments completely by doing this. And my question then to Kazi is that the silt that is coming down, because the Podha joins the Brahmaputra and the Meghna, which are also coming from the mountains. So there's a whole lot of silt over there, right? Bangladesh is essentially shifting silt. What does that do to the life in that part of the delta?
We're all silt. I'm just silt
All
certified. Right. Yeah, no, it's all silt. I mean, that's a fantastic point, Arati, because the water of rivers, especially in deltaic places, as well as the Ganga, it's not just water, it's sediment and silt. And we must know that. First of all, it's about flow. I think the Sanskritic meaning of Ganga is actually to go, to flow, right? Ganga is generically a river because it flows. And it does not flow with just water only, it flows with silt and sediment. So that's number one. And why it is a delta? Because it's a very shallow declension from top to bottom. And when the silt comes rushing in, it gets slowed down and it gets deposited with any kind of little obstruction that it gets. And then it kind of changes the flow of water around it. So silt is very important for a number of reasons. First of all, silt is what during overflow, I don't call it flooding anymore. I mentioned, flooding is become a connotation of disaster because in some sense, flooding is required, needed by farmers and even fishermen and people living along the banks of the river. So when the river in the delta overflows water, it brings the silt along also. And then when the water recedes, it gets deposited in the land and that creates the fertile landscapes of Bengal. I mean, it's not coincidental that it's the densest place on earth.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, it is also the most fertile place on earth. I mean, you don't have to do anything. You just sit around and throw a bunch of seeds and you're sure the seeds will pop up into plants. So silt leads to a way of life, living, sustenance. So that's one. Secondly, silt, recreates the landscape. It creates the biodiversity, the fish, the small fish that goes in and creates new kind of habitats. So everything kind of falls with the flow of the water and the silt. Silt, as I said, also now in modern times is what, after transformation and baking, becomes buildings, bricks and buildings. So, we have to think about that also. But I think what you need to kind of think of the amount of silt. You just mentioned, how much silt or sediment that have to be extracted away to counter the impact of the barrage. The amount of sediment that flows flows to the Padma side annually, according to one English geographer in the 19th century, is equal to 300 pyramids. Annually, 300 pyramids are just rushing down the Padma into the ocean. So that's one. The other thing is that the silt, well, where is it rushing down to? It's going into the bed of the Bay of Bengal, and it's creating, it's named by geologists as an underwater delta, subaqueous delta, as the term is. And it spreads out under the Bay of Bengal and goes all the way to the Indian Ocean near the equator. And it has been given a name by geologists. It's called the Bengal fan, the size of which is the two Bengals put together. So there are two Bengals under the Bay of Bengal in the form of silt. The superficial length of Ganges is about 2,600 kilometers. And the length of the Bengal fan from its origin at the coast to all the way down to where Indian Ocean is about the same.
Yep.
So there's another Ganga flowing under, if you like, under the Bay of Bengal. So I think, and that's, to me, I mean, I'm an architect, I'm not a geographer, geologist, or hydrologist. I work with them, but I think that's incredible. And I can tell you now that could be another exercise or investigation, what that amount of silt, the content of the silt under the water with the ocean currents is creating what kind of, ecology under the water. And if any disruption to that, what would happen? I don't know. I mean, that's another set of investigation.
You bring up a really good point. There is, I think there's a number that just try to wrap your head around it. So he just talked about the silt that comes down the river and into the Bay of Bengal and deposits on the bed of the Bay of Bengal. Can you get an I would like to just see if anybody can even guess how thick that bed is. In somebody who's closest to maybe 10 kilometers, and I'll give you a thumbs up. It's 16 kilometers deep, which means two Everests stacked one on top of the other under the water, on the bed. That's how much silt there is in this Bengal fan. And the water that goes through like this, it has carved a canyon on the Bay of Bengal's bed called the Swatch of No Ground. It's a massive canyon, 21 kilometers deep. And that one has amazing fish and biodiversity. And Bangladesh has had the foresight to declare a part of it as a sanctuary even. And I mean, there's just fascinating. I think the point that we're both trying to make here is that the river does not end at the mouth. The river influences so much more all the way into the ocean. And so when we talk about, oh, the river water is going waste to the sea, we really haven't understood anything about what a river is. Because the river is not just water, first of all, it's also silt. And then the silt itself is creating something that we haven't talked about. It's creating a whole lot of livelihood for people because the silt is just suspended in water. It's sediment suspended in water. And during the dry season, it just comes up to the top and forms islands. These islands are not land, they're not water. They belong to no one. They birthed from the womb of the river, and the river can claim it back anytime. And these are called chors and saporis. In Assam, it's called sapori. Here in Bengal, it's called chors. And these chors are the lifeline of people who live by the river because they're constantly losing their land to erosion. And then this thing comes up in the middle of the river. The chor comes up in the middle of the river, and then they rush to cultivate it because it's really rich, fertile land. And so that is the kind of shifting lifestyle that's there in the Bengal Delta, something it's incomprehensible to someone who lives in a city like me. But when I went there and you see it for yourself, it's amazing. Now, what's interesting is that borders sometimes, like the border between West Bengal and Jharkhand, there's a part which says that the border shall run where the Ganga flows. And the Ganga does not flow in the same place. There are these chors that come up, and then the border shifts this way, so these people become Jharkhandis. Then the chor is taken away, and then there's no place for these people to go there. Now they're not Jharkhandis, now they're West Bengal people. And so it's playing havoc. So this part of the Delta, the Deltaic Bengal, is an incomprehensible kind of political land situation because the land does not have these belongings anymore. There's no ownership of the land that you can actually say over there, right?
I mean, it's contentious. First of all, the rivers have shifted. Padma has shifted a few hundred kilometers from, say, 300 years ago to where it is now. So there are claims and counterclaims, and people have documents that, there's land under the river which belongs to us, and they're looking at the river and waiting when the chors will rise and their homesteads, will be given back to them. I mean, this is kind of eternal story of, people in Bangladesh, living in the river.
Also Bengal.
Also West Bengal. But I think more, I would say, dramatic. And
80% is happening there.
Right. Right. So chores and another thing. Silt is one thing, and silts lead to chores, as Arati just mentioned. As I showed you in the photograph, it's I describe it as very cosmogonic. It's just appearing before you. Like the forming of a universe is condensed in one monsoon season where there was water or nothing, if you like. Just a little twig in the water will create a little obstruction, and a little silt will deposit, and it will start depositing more and more, and it will form an island. But then that island, there's no guarantee that next monsoon, when the water comes again, whether that island will be there or not. Sometimes it'll be there for a few years, sometimes more, and sometimes not. And sometimes it can be as stable as the city of Dhaka, and we all claim to be in a very stable, dry ground, and who knows what will happen. So, but in Bangladesh, geologically, there are three kinds of deltas, and deltas are basically chores, just deposit of silts that have happened over 20,000 years. Um, Bengal was a part of the sea. It was an estuary like Bombay, all the way up to Raj Mahal,
Yes,
where the
that's right.
silts start to
Yep.
kind of, get deposited. And the estuary, because of the depositing of the silt over the last 20,000 years, have become the delta, which is just the vector of silt deposit. And it's just not gets deposited and sits there. It's just fluctuating all the time with the slight, subtle movement. There are beautiful descriptions by Rabindranath Tagore in Chinno Patraboli. I don't know if anybody has read his letters to his niece. Don't want to refer Tagore all the time. Bengalis would have to refer Tagore. But when I read Chinno Patraboli, I was just amazed because, Tagore lived in the Padma area in Shilaidaho. Well, the family had an estate there, or three estates actually, across the Padma. And Rabindranath would ply on the Padma and other rivers on a boat, which was called the Padma. And his description of the river and the sand islands just incredible. I call it phenomenological. And then there are descriptions by others how to handle the chores. Colonial times, James Rennell, the cartographer, who was dispatched from Calcutta just 5 years after the Battle of Plassey to find a river route from Calcutta to Dhaka. So he took on a boat, and he was the first, modern. He did the first modern mapping of the rivers of Bengal, and then he did a map of, it became the famous map of Hindustan. The subtitle is interesting: A Map of Hindustan in a Theatre of War and Commerce.
So is it? By the way, the cover of Marginlands, very faintly, if you go really look at it carefully, I've put the map of Rennell.
Right. No, but I mentioned Rennell, but because there is the cartographer describing the Padma, and then there's the poet, Tagore, describing the Padma. And for me, it's such an incredible understanding. Both are valid, both are important, both can be critiqued one way or another. Was Tagore being very poetic? Was Rennell applying his Western rigor as an engineer on an unruly landscape, all that thing? But, we have to contend with both.
It must have been a real nightmare to map something like this.
Nightmare, I don't know if first they realized that, because I think the English came to Bengal with an image of the Thames in their mind. Thames is a manageable river. It's like a ribbon. Padma is not a ribbon, or Brahmaputra is not a ribbon, or many rivers in the subcontinent is not a ribbon. It overflows, and next year it has shifted, and it fluctuates all the time. How do you map that? Which to me, Arati, ultimately is what led me to rethink my notion of landscape in Bengal and the whole business of doing architecture. Because if the landscape is unmappable, I mean, it's mappable, but you have to upgrade it every day. But kind of, so it really defeats the purpose of a map. So doing a map of the delta, I mean, of course, is needed. And the English did all this mapping, incredible mapping. Rennell's map is famous. His journey from Calcutta to Dhaka produced the map of Bengal. It's referred, looked at, but we know that it's not reliable.
Yeah,
So it's needed, but not reliable.
totally. And I think you bring up, you mentioned something which was super on point, that the Britishers came with the notion of the Thames to India and thought the rivers are like this. And unfortunately, a lot of the policies they brought would have worked on the Thames, but would never work on our rivers, and which is why we are left with miles and miles of embankments, which basically do two things. One is that they are supposed to try and tame the river, and our rivers are wild, they're untamable. And what they do is that they try to make it straight and narrow, like a pipe or a canal. And what ends up happening is, like Kazi mentioned earlier, the whole point of a river is to overflow during the monsoons. And when it overflows, it goes and spreads the silt, makes it fertile, makes the food bowls. And these silt islands, which Kazi spoke of also, I think it was some 600 kgs of rice per acre versus, somewhere else where it will be 60 or something like that. So like order of magnitude different. And the thing is, that was one, but the other thing is that it would also carry little fingerlings, and that would go off into the wetlands and then again join the system when the water flows out, when during the ebb. And when you build the embankments, you're basically cutting that off. You're cutting those kidneys of the river actually off. So it doesn't get filtered. You don't have the fish coming in. And what we have ended up with, unfortunately, because of all the embankments and miles of them, all the way from the Brahmaputra to Ganga to Podda, everywhere, are floods which are disastrous now, because people think there's an embankment and there's this false sense of security and they build behind it, which the rivers aren't tameable, so that doesn't help. And also that we have seen a drastic drop in fish in the Ganga-Brahmaputra basin, 85 to 90% drop in fish. And so even on the Brahmaputra, on the banks of the Brahmaputra, in Dibrugarh, in the market, if you go, you're going to see farmed fish farmed in Kanpur, fish farmed in Andhra Pradesh, coming in trucks on beds of ice. You don't get fish from the river anymore. So, I think that mentality of what will work in one place will work in the other has really changed the ecology of South Asia. And one of the things that I keep harping about in Marginlands is the importance of understanding local geographies, which is exactly what Kazi is talking about, that if you were to build something in Bangladesh that you would think you can build it like you would build in London, think again.
Right, which is the point about the engineering vision of the landscape, which is about straight lines, orthogonal, to see the rivers as ribbons. Maybe in some places the rivers are ribbons, but not in the delta. So wishing a ribbon for a deltaic meandering or braided river was just like a impossible task.
Correct.
And then which led to engineering projects of the orthogonal type, the embankments, the dikes, the bridges, the bunds, the barrages, and with all these consequences, as you mentioned, and which we have to deal with, and which we have inherited, after the, after the long gone and all that, that perception of the landscape which we live in and that we need to reconceive. We inherited that sort of, I wouldn't say twisted, but perhaps it's twisted. I meant straight, but it's actually twisted perception of the landscape. So the book is actually a revision of that perception. Now, that also, Arati, makes me want to say why, how the book was done. I don't know if that was another thing that you wanted to talk about. So what should be the content of the book? So the book is really, to me, how a river should be described, narrated, represented. Forget Padma or forget, any named river. How a river is to be narrated, seen, represented. Amitabh Ghosh wrote the preface to the book, and he mentions the Padma, Podda as many avatars. And if a river or any natural phenomenon has avatars, one single person, one single discipline, or even few disciplines won't do justice to it. You need like multiple ways of talking about it. And that is why in the book I invited people, from diverse fields, from geography, of course, from anthropologists, from film critics, to architects, to urban designers, to food historians.
Yes.
And the book has photographs, of course, the quickest way to render the place. Maps, faulty maps, but maps, you can actually reconstruct a history of perception of the landscape through maps, that's interesting. And I have to say this, the first map belongs to the Greeks. Not that any maps exist of that time, but there are descriptions in Ptolemy in the 2nd century BC or C, I can't remember. Ptolemy mentions that there are 5 mouths to the Ganges. It's quite accurate.
It is, yeah.
It is quite accurate. And Renel described there are 8 mouths to the Ganges and on this whole thing. But there are 5 mouths to the Ganges. And possibly that's the, that's the termination of the subcontinent. In his mind, that's the termination of the known world. In Greek description, there is intra-Gangium and extra-Gangium. The Ganges is the boundary of the known world, known to the Greeks. Intra-Gangium is within Ganges and extra-Ganges is outside. And the mouth of the Ganges is, where it ends. So the perception of the river, writing about the rivers, and and in your book you do that also, perhaps not thinking about how to write about rivers, but that comes out. And I have come up with this term, river realm. So river, well, of course, you go to a river, you can find a river bank and there is a little gradation of, wet and dry. It's not like starkly dry and wet, as you might find on, when you go to the Gateway of India, and I was there this morning and I was standing on the edge and there is wet water and here I am dry. On the riverbanks in Bengal, no, there's a gradation. I mean, that also led to another point that I have made. An imagination that's based on dry ideology. Trying to keep things dry, which is really related again to the engineering vision of the world. Why do you do embankment and barrages and bunds? Because you want to keep this area dry, and you don't want to get wet. But people do get wet, and what are the people who get wet? They are the marginal people, marginlands. Farmers, fishermen, and all those sort of those people who live out there in that muddy landscape. Mud is another thing that we must talk about, There's no philosophy of mud. There's philosophy of water, and mud must be discussed, right? So people who live with mud, and they're the fishermen and the boatmen and the farmers, they're waddling into the, children in the villages that jump off into the water and coming in and out. No, in the city we don't, we are wary of water, we are wary of flooding. And of course, when flood comes, that's the first thing we worry, that we don't get wet. So this is what I describe as sort of a contestation between dry ideology and wet ideology. And I think dry ideology leads to barrages, embankments, bunds, and all those things that the engineering department produces, or the engineering vision produces. So a revision of that is to rethink the world of ours out of a wet ideology. I think Inakshi mentioned something. What's common with Arati and I is that, we are perhaps doing a critique of how the landscapes are being re-engineered with great sort of repercussions on our life afterwards. I, as an architect, is also trying to rethink what else can be done. I'm trying to do what I think, and I'm not just a critique, I have to reimagine.
And I think it behooves all of us to reimagine. As one of the shepherds that I work with, and I mentioned in Marginlands also, he says that before the actual crisis comes a crisis of imagination. That's exactly what it is. We really need to see the land for what it is and imagine based on that. Thank you so much, Kazi. This has just been wonderful. I think we might have time for a few questions. If anybody in the audience would like to ask a question. Yes. Is there a mic that will be going or something? And while the mic reaches him, this is just a fantastic, I feel that this is the kind of book that needs to be taught in engineering colleges, because we really need to see it in a more rounded whole story.
Right. I've got friends in engineering who works with hydrology. I haven't heard from them.
Yes.
Thank you so much for all the knowledge that you shared. It was really great to hear all about the architecture and the thoughts behind making something. So I have been wondering, and I've been writing about a lot, how architecture and human society or human thinking affects nature in general. All the construction that is happening, the materials that we use, how sustainable are these materials, and then the way services are planned around it, air conditioning, plumbing, electricals, all of these. So if there is a leakage, generally the idea of making a building or making a structure has been for it to be there for centuries together.
Right.
Right. So these days, because of the services and ill maintenance, what is happening is the life is left to only 30, 40 years.
So how to make a building sustainable?
How, as we as architects or engineers are responsible to awaken the humankind.
Right.
I think certainly. Yeah.
How to awaken a consciousness about this topic?
Yeah, sort of.
Yes.
Well, an event like this is certainly very helpful, but something more beyond this that we can do.
Right.
The materials.
Materials. Okay. Well, that's very a precise architectural topic. But I think the way I look at rivers and how that has impacted me as an architect, lends to thinking about responsible way of doing whatever you want to do, buildings, roadways, cities, in the context of the rhythm and the dynamics of nature in the landscape. We have to work with the rhythm of the landscape. This is what I've been trying to do. Arati, I used to write, and I write little less now, in the English newspaper in Dhaka, the more popular one. Since the early 1990s, it relates to your question. And I was writing about Dhaka city, and it's a critique of all the negative things about the city, and it's very easy to do. And every day you pick up the newspaper, there's something there: pollution in the river, traffic, criminality, and so on and so forth. And in the early 90s, I started writing like that, the dark side of the city. And I thought that's very easy. And I'm an architect. I did not do that. My job is to kind of, be a bit more visionary, if I may say so. What can be done? So I started writing about options with visualizations, because I can also draw. What can the city be in the context of the landscape it is in, which is the Delta landscape? In Dhaka city, it's like a little island. There are rivers all around it, and there are wetlands and floodplains. The way the city is developing, this is how it connects to you, is by landfills, filling up the wetlands, encroaching on the rivers, and I don't mean the illegal ones, even the urban planners of Dhaka city are doing that filled up vast area of wetlands, precious wetlands, they can never come back. And there's incredible wetland situations, and the floodplains and the agricultural lands, agricultural land is vanishing. So it seems, of course, this is coming out of an economic drive. You must have, land is monetized. That's number one. And then land is monetized, land is planned and parceled off. It's then sold, and then apartment buildings are built. That seems to be the process. And I'm not against that. But we have to find a different way of, we don't have to be at loggerheads with each other. And I say that Dhaka and the Delta are at loggerheads with each other. No, we have to find a third option, and has not been found yet, except for my few sort of, imaginary drawings. An urbanism that works with the rhythm of the landscape. I don't have images to show here. So that is at the large scale. And I think, first of all, it needs to start from the large scale. How to be sustainable, responsive as an architect. No matter what you're building, you're doing a building or doing a little wall, it has properties that impacts the landscape. And on materiality, well, that's a long question, how to deal with materiality. I'll have to ask you to read Gandhi, actually. His little hut in Nagpur, Papu Kuti. They had prescriptions. Gandhi and Miraben, I think Miraben helped build the little hut. There were descriptions on what materials to get, not outside a radius of 5 miles, what are the materials that are to be assembled. And I think that's a manifesto of sustainability. We don't have to look at sort of imported Western sort of ordinances and proclamations of sustainability, and then people in the villages and rural areas, they practice sustainability. That's the wisdom that they have. So I think just on that point of materiality, we just have to look inward and what we do, our own practices. Of course, nowadays you have all kind of materials. If you want to put together a modern building, there are pieces that are coming from Venezuela, China, Bolivia, and England. Nail is cheaper to import a nail from England than buy it off a market in Colaba, I think, because it's all about the nature of pricing, the manufacture of raw materials. I mean, that's a very tough one.
Yep, this question right here, and that was.
This is Sudhakar Malpe. I took birth in front of the ocean as well as back of the river in Karnataka state. So coming back to my visit to Assam, especially the Brahmaputra, the only river which has got the male name. So that's very, very fascinating. So I have one question for you as well as to the madam. Especially the silt and delta economics is something fantastic you have imagined and explained to us. But why the government or the local bodies are refusing to accept these abundance, economics benefits? That's one thing. Is there any problem with that, or what exactly stops them? Sir, especially for you, because you explained about in the last concluding this thing, the wet as well as dry the things. Can you tell us little detail about it? Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
You go first, Arati. Maybe there are different economies operating here. They're not one singular economy. And there are the dominant economies. Of course, the dominant economy is the one that's tied up with global economy. And the global economy has a history. It hasn't happened in the last 10 years or 15 years or 50 years. It's part of our sort of in a relationship with Western Europe and the sort of the techniques, the rationale, and the methods of Western Europe, which is what I describe as the engineering method or the engineering vision. The other way to look at it is, propagation of the dry ideology, to remain dry. And that's a very sort of urban-based, the dominant societal, at least in the context of Bangladesh, and one could pursue that in other places also. So that's what is preferred. That sort of position even differs. What I want to think about is the third urban option that works with the fluctuations of water. You can let water in and let water will then recede. There are, quite a bit of incredible architectural practices or landscape architectural practices in China. A good friend of mine, Conjian Yu, which will write Conjian Yu, Y-U, if you want to look him up. He's doing some incredible work where he's working with urban flooding and allowing water, as he says in his declaration, making friends with flood rather than putting up barriers. So that's one kind of third option that I'm looking for. But on the other hand, there's the economy where water, silting, wetness are a necessary part of life and livelihood, which I already mentioned, the farmers, the fishermen, and people who are in the landscape. So there is, maybe it's a very literally dry distinction between the two. And one is more dominant than the other. So the dominant one obviously wants to push the silt away. They're not interested in silt. But it is important, because of the agricultural production, silt and all that, it is connected. So it's a kind of a peculiar situation where this is not, I haven't seen silt described, enumerated in the Constitution or the 5-year plans of Bangladesh. I've been reading that, the last 5-year plans, there are descriptions of agricultural production, this and that. but no mention of silt. So you make me raise a very important question. Silt should be in the Constitution.
And to answer your question of why it may not be, is probably in our education, which is a colonial hangover, because we are being taught in the way that those guys brought it down to us, and all of our engineering, in fact, seems to be a one size fits all, whereas one size won't even fit all of India. You know, what happens in Kolkata is not the same thing that happens in Dhaka, even, you know. So we need to step back, slow down, rethink, unlearn, do all of that, and do what is right by the land. So we'll have to, like Kazi mentioned, the hydrologist will have to speak to the civil engineer, will have to speak to the biologist, will have to speak to the urban planner. Those silos need to be broken down. This is hard work. Everybody is very easy, and status quo is really hard. And then, of course, it's much more economical and much more fiscally lucrative,
or convenient, or just convenient.
Convenient, yes, fiscally convenient too, to just continue with what's going on. And I must say that in every such place which has been a disaster, there has always been a voice which has been saying, "This will not work. Please don't do this. This is not good." And that voice has never been listened to historically. And that's basically because we are not living in a perfect world. We're living with, irrational ways of doing things. And so I think, all of those things come together. And I think the beginning is, can we make our education locally relevant first? I think it'll begin from there. We'll start beginning to see change from there.
And just one thing to add here, even terminologies that we use, they need to be reconfigured or even turned around. In urban planning, there is a term called land use planning, which is how cities grow, because this is what you allow here or what you don't allow here. And I have been saying this, which has been picked up by some people, that in Dhaka, you can't talk about land use planning. It has to be land water / water use planning, because, it's sometimes it is land, sometimes it is water, even in the heart of Dhaka city. So the moment you say land use planning, you're giving privilege to land, you're giving privilege to dryness. It's already kind of built in the mechanism, right? So, and I can cite a few other things like that. I was just looking at some of the photographs here, the old photographs, and there's an old map of Bombay, the 7 islands. And the central area is marked as, swampy land or aquatic land. And I think it says in the map something like, not good for products.
Yes, it's non-revenue, therefore wasteland.
Non-revenue, wasteland.
Yes. So that's a whole different conversation, and we can really go down a rabbit hole there. I don't know whether we have time for any more questions. No, we don't. Okay. Thank you so much for your interest, and thank you, Kazi, for an excellent conversation.
Thank you.